Verdienst. Now I'm going to switch into English now since all of our speakers are going to be addressing us in English. The first one is nothing short of the world's most influential economist, according to the New York Times. That's not the only superlative I'm going to have to put in use introducing him. The speaker is going to show us why this year that we just entered is going to be one of the most remarkable ones in world history, geopolitically as well as economically. 2015, as we will see in a minute, is a crucial year for the world. Professor Jeffrey Sachs is the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. The Earth Institute is one of the world's great centers for research on climate change and the environment, and the multifaceted problems on economic and social development throughout the world. He served as an advisor to several of the transitional economies, both in Latin America and in Eastern Europe. And he's also the special advisor to the General Secretary of the UN, the second one in a row, among other things playing a key role in the formulating of the UN development goals. So need I mention that he also, in between all this, found time to write books, at least 3 best-selling ones. Now, when I heard Professor Sachs give his presentation in Oslo yesterday, he only had one little problem. He had been deprived of something quite important for his presentation, namely his voice. So my counterpart in Norway suggested that I feed him some gammeldansk and some herring. I didn't quite succeed in having Professor Sachs agreeing with me on this, which is probably why we have him here with us. Professor Sachs, very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Good morning. Oh, my word. Thank you. Let me try that again. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And my apologies. I lost my voice somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, arriving in Oslo. I was hoping I would find it by Copenhagen, and it's part of the way there. I did start out the morning with the herring, indeed. So I hope that by the middle of the speech, my voice is audible. But let me say what a pleasure it is to be with you here in Copenhagen, and how grateful I am to Skagen for inviting me to their annual conference and celebration of the opening of 2015. We do obviously live in very complicated times, and the events in Paris yesterday shock us and remind us how turbulent the world is and how unsettled it is, and how in the midst of all of the progress, knowledge, capacity that we have, we still find ourselves stuck in tragic and senseless and meaningless wars. From my point of view, this is really the most important question we face. The world is on a dangerous course, unfortunately, not only in the kind of violence that we saw yesterday, but in the environmental destruction that we are inadvertently causing through our economic activity, through societies that are becoming more and more unequal over time. And as I'll try to explain this morning, at a fundamental level, these are all solvable problems. In fact, it wouldn't take too much to make quite fundamental steps forward. But the question for us, and it's a question that will be posed very specifically in 2015, is whether we can find the cooperative impulse globally to take those steps forward. It happens that this is a year of critical negotiation. It is actually the most important negotiating year on the calendar that we will have in our generation for the questions of development. If we get things right, we can make an important step forward. If we miss the chance, I'm a little bit afraid of what the consequences will be. Let me try to explain what I have in mind. Let me start with a wonderfully wise, powerful, and still shocking statement of President Kennedy that he made in his inaugural address, when he said, "For we hold in our mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." This is really the existential reality of our modern period. The technologies that we have, the economic might that we have, makes it possible to envision the end of poverty. We're actually remarkably close. Of course, I'm talking in a country that has achieved that to the complete extent and demonstrates what can be accomplished globally. But at the same time, as President Kennedy said, that power isn't necessarily directed towards the problem solving. Our technological capacity also built the thermonuclear weapons that he was referring to, and also built the worldwide energy system today, fossil fuel based, that actually threatens our civilization in a more insidious and less direct manner, but still in a huge way. My guru at Harvard University was Professor E.O. Wilson, whom many of you will know as one of the greatest biologists of modern times, and a person who led the way in the study of the biology of human nature and human cooperation. His statement I find similarly powerful for us. He wrote in a foreword to a book of mine a couple of years ago, "For we have stumbled into the 21st century with our Stone Age emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technologies." And Professor Wilson's point is that our basic human nature was forged on the savannah 100,000 years ago. It was forged as a complex mix of cooperation and killing. We bring that human nature to us every day. Our institutions were forged centuries ago at a deep level. The long reach of our institutional knowledge, capacity, and understanding is a shadow for today when the institutions don't comport with our needs. And yet, the thing that runs ahead like nothing else is our technology. And there, as I will say, and as Vivek will say in a few minutes, the acceleration of our technological know-how is astounding. But how it's used remains the open question with our Stone Age emotions. And one more great thinker I want to introduce, Paul Crutzen, Nobel laureate in chemistry, who was one of the three scientists who discovered the mechanisms of ozone depletion, understanding that the chlorofluorocarbons, when they reached the stratosphere, would dissociate and the chlorine would attack the ozone, and the dissipation of the ozone layer would threaten human well-being and indeed the whole biosphere. Crutzen has characterized our epoch, our age, as actually a new geological age, which he's given the name the Anthropocene, or the human era. And Crutzen's point is more than metaphorical, as I'll emphasize. It's that we've entered a new period of the Earth's history. We've left the Holocene, which was the period after the Ice Age, that brought us civilization, and we've entered the Anthropocene, which is the period when our human activity is so large, its weight on the physical environment is so great that we are actually, of course, the main drivers now of the Earth's climate, of the ocean chemistry, of the biodiversity, of the land use. It's extraordinary. One species out of 10 million has taken over the basic Earth dynamics. Now, these are all fundamental trends, but 2015 turns out to be a remarkable year in which we have a chance to begin to change a direction and bring powerful and dangerous trends back under human control in an ethical, and political, and social manner, rather than simply in the geologic manner that Crutzen is talking about. I say that we have entered the age of sustainable development. And I mean that not that we are guaranteed to achieve sustainable development, but that we have entered the age when the question of sustainable development is the paramount question that we face on the planet. Sustainable development, you know, is a concept that emerged in this region. It's a concept that has been put onto the world's platter by Gru Harlem Brundtland in her brilliant commission in 1987, which said that sustainable development is the challenge of our time. In 1992, in the Earth Summit in Rio, for the first time, the world adopted in a formal international legal sense the concept of sustainable development. But while it adopted it, it did not implement a strategy of sustainable development. And we're at a crossroads in 2015 because we have not yet succeeded, neither from 1987, nor from the Earth Summit in 1992, nor might I say to the Copenhagen Summit in 2009, when expectations were so high for a climate agreement. We have not yet succeeded to this moment in achieving a direction of sustainable development. It happens, however, that 2015 gives us a crucial opportunity. But it's a fleeting opportunity because it won't come again in 2016 or 2017 and so on for the reasons that I'll suggest. So the 193 member states of the United Nations have adopted sustainable development as their core principle. And at the 20th anniversary of the Rio Summit, which took place again in Rio in June 2012, the governments reiterated sustainable development as the organizing principle for the shared perspectives internationally on development. They defined sustainable development also in 2012 in what I regard as a very practical and accessible way. You'll recall that when Dr. Brundtland put the definition of sustainable development before the world in 1987, her definition was that sustainable development means that the current generation meets its needs in a way that allows future generations to meet their needs. An intergenerational idea. But the problem was, it wasn't a very accessible, approachable, operational definition. And it has gradually changed to a different way of presentation, but with the same meaning. And that is that sustainable development means the holistic approach to society in which objectives of economics, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability are all taken together. So sustainable development is now defined as a holistic approach of economic progress, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. And that makes the terms of sustainable development in the negotiations of 2015, I think, concrete and helpful for moving forward. Because of the coincidence of the calendar, 3 crucial negotiations will take place in 2015. And all 3 are intertwined, and success or failure will rise or fall together with all 3 meetings. In July of this year, there will be a so-called Conference on International Financing of Development, but it will probably be rechristened as International Financing of Sustainable Development by the time that we get to Addis Ababa in July. The idea there is to recast the international financial system, both the public and the private financial system, because they have to work in tandem. And I think for Skagen and for all investors, this is therefore extremely relevant that the international financial system be redirected to be financing long-term sustainable development. And I'll come back to that in a moment, what that means. 2 months after the Addis Ababa conference will be a meeting at the United Nations headquarters, which will probably be the largest gathering of world leaders in history. I would expect 170 or 180 heads of state and government to be at the United Nations in September 2015 to adopt Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. These, if it works, will be the organizing principles for global cooperation for the coming generation. The Millennium Development Goals have been the operating shared perspective during the period 2000 till 2015. The MDGs focused on reducing extreme poverty. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, will focus on the broad, holistic approach to global sustainable development. The MDGs were for the poor countries. The SDGs will be universal goals. In other words, in principle, they will apply to all countries, rich and poor. 2 months after that will come COP21. You know all about that in Copenhagen. And you know how difficult and how tenuous this process is on climate change. Now, it's a coincidence in a way that 2015 is both the period to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals and to focus on climate change. And the way we got there is that 2015 is the end of the Millennium Development Goal period. And it is the year that's the fallback position, in essence, to the Copenhagen Summit on Climate. In 2009, all eyes were on Copenhagen to seal the deal on climate change. And the notion was that after 1992, we still had not yet implemented the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Copenhagen would be the place to do it. And we know that it didn't work. It didn't work, most importantly, because the 2 leading emitting countries in the world, China and the United States, had not really found the way, either of them alone or as part of their bilateral relationship, to have an approach to climate change. And so what came out of Copenhagen was the famous picture of world leaders huddled together in the room at the last moment, trying to hammer out an agreement that they never could reach. And when the meeting ended with a declaration rather than an agreement, I would say the question was, is there viability left in the multilateral negotiations? Many people declared the UN Framework Convention dead at that point. But the convention, the secretariat, and the parties to the convention picked themselves up and by the following year said, we're going to try again. We'll try again in 2015. Unfortunately, it doesn't give you the sense of urgency exactly, because in 2010 they said, we'll try again in 2015 to reach an agreement that will go into force in 2018 to begin implementation in 2020, as if we have all the time in the world, which we certainly don't. But what it did mean was that 2015 became the focal point for everything that followed Copenhagen to try to find the path to a climate agreement. So here we are. I've been speaking about this, like many people, for 6 years, 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, 2 years. Now we're here. We're in 2015, and we have 11 months to reach a serious agreement in Paris. The reason I do think it's our last chance is that I cannot imagine picking up the pieces one more time and saying what we really meant was 2021. Nobody will believe it. If we don't make it now, we're not going to make it. And so these 3 summits over a 6-month period, in my opinion, have the chance to redirect the world, not to solve the problems, not to solve the technical issues, certainly not to have a notable change in day-to-day life at the start, because every part of the sustainable development process is a 20, 30, 40-year process of reorientation. But it could be the time that we shift from directing this way to directing this way. And I want to spend a few minutes to say why it's so urgent that we do so. This is not a light issue, even though it is not, in general, the issue of day-to-day discussion. Now, I must say, in Scandinavia, it almost is the issue of day-to-day discussion. In my country, in the United States, it's the issue mentioned once every few years. Very few people talk about it, at least in political life. And that's part of our problem in the world, that the world's largest economy hasn't faced up to the issue yet. And in China, it's beginning to be understood. But we are also not only at the end of the diplomatic timeline, we're at the end of our physical timeline to reorient direction. And I want to explain that. Now, I'm not going to make a forecast of whether we're going to succeed, because who knows? But I do want to make a backcast to ask what would it take to succeed. So I'm much better at backcasting than I am at forecasting anyway. Most of us are. The question is, what does it take to succeed in 2015? So why is it so important? Why are we at a crossroads? Am I just speaking in hyperbole to give a morning speech? I think not. That would not be a good use of your time now, nor a good use of my time. I think this is the real deal. This is not a trial run. And to my mind, when I lecture about economic development, I start at the beginning of the modern age. And that is with this emblematic machine, the biggest transformation of the planet in modern history for the last 10,000 years, actually. And that is the steam engine. Because it was James Watt's insight in 1776 that gave us the modern fossil fuel age and the ability to use coal, oil, and gas to make the modern economy. And so with the harnessing of coal, with Watt, and then through the age of oil, now the age of natural gas, we have a world energy system that has mobilized unprecedented amounts of energy to organize human activity and has supported a rise of world output at least 100 times larger than at the beginning of the industrial age. Everything changed with this machine. And as economic historians, we talk about the long Kondraty of waves of technological change that followed the steam engine. So these are waves of technological impulse, starting with steam and its applications of rail and large-scale metallurgy, and then electrification in the chemical industry, automobiles, petrochemicals, and now the information age that we live in. And it is these waves of technology set loose by fossil fuel that have made the modern world economy. And what's remarkable is that on a human scale, everything changed decisively with the birth of the modern technological age. This is a famous diagram essentially constructed by Angus Maddison, the great late macro historian, to estimate the level of human output, the gross world product, over the period of the Common Era. And you see, this is not a smooth ascent. Economic growth was not a normal phenomenon. Economic growth was let loose by the modern era of tapping fossil fuels. Without that, we never had the energy to expand other areas of economic activity. So economic output just went vertical after 2 millennia at stagnant subsistence levels. And actually, since 10,000 BC, the beginning of the Holocene, until the industrial era, the world was subsistence farmers. And of course, if you look at output per capita, per person, the graph looks the same. The output per person rose from what we would now measure as something like $1,000 per person to around $10,000 per person, from the industrial, pre-industrial, to the modern period. And of course, along with that came a similar graph of population, which has increased 10 times roughly since Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, warning us about population increase. We've gone from about 900 million people at the time of Malthus to 7.3 billion people now, and we will reach 8 billion people on the planet in the year 2024, and on the current trajectory, 9 billion people in the year 2040. So again, the human population soared. Taken together, we have had an unprecedented, in the history of Earth and in the history of humanity, an unprecedented change of scale in a very short period of time. And this is the essential problem of sustainable development. The planet has remained just where it was 2 centuries ago, but humanity is now 100 times higher impact on the planet, and this is deranging every part of the Earth's physical systems. One example that is being deranged, of course, is the atmospheric chemistry, and in particular, the concentrations of greenhouse gases. So this is the same kind of curve, but now over 800,000 years. If you start on the left-hand side of the curve, you have the level of CO2 in the atmosphere estimated by isotopic concentrations from 800,000 years ago. And what happens in this line is that CO2 goes up and down over periods of roughly 100,000 year cycles as the Earth's orbit changes, changing slightly solar radiation and causing CO2 to degas from the deep oceans or to be reabsorbed in the deep oceans. And all of that is a relatively constant, stable fluctuation over 800,000 years. And then if you can see the right-hand side, the blink of the eye, the last moment, that's us. All of a sudden, the needle goes straight up to the top of the graph. We break out of a level of CO2 that the Earth has not seen for the last 3 million years, So we're now in a completely unprecedented era We have a higher level of CO2 than at any time, certainly in human history, but any time in the last 3 million years. And this is the reason, of course, why the climate is changing decisively. So all of the graphs look the same. Stable until the industrial period, almost vertical since then, and pushing against the limits. Now, on the good side, technology looks the same. And there's much to be grateful for in the technological advances. This is a graph that looks almost identical to the other ones. It's another kind of exponential growth. This one is Moore's law exponential growth. It's the doubling of the transistor count on a silicon chip that has been doubling every 18 to 24 months since the first integrated circuit was made in 1959. We've had 28 doublings. We're about 1 billion times more powerful in the processing, storage, and transmission of data than was true 50 years ago. That's what gives us our distinct technological edge in this generation. Intel put 5 billion transistors on the chip last year compared to 2 transistors on the chip in 1961. And that's making possible other exponential growth, like the spread of mobile phones, which is the fastest penetration of a new technology in human history, going from a few tens of thousands of subscribers back in 1980 to 7 billion subscribers this year. Completely unprecedented exponential growth. And what it means for development, I find exemplified by this picture of Shenzhen, China. Many of you visit Shenzhen because of its centrality in the world economy. This is the picture of Shenzhen in 1980 when there were about 23,000 farm families, or 23,000 people in farm families on the rural neighborhood of Hong Kong. And from the same view, this is the current picture of Shenzhen. And so it's remarkable what exponential growth means for development in a short period of time. Take another look. I find it astounding. By the way, I went to China in 1994 to Shanghai, where they showed me a model of what a part of Shanghai would look like. And it was currently just a flat plain, and they showed a picture like this, and I left the building thinking they were out of their minds, that they were going to build a Manhattan in 10 years, and sure enough, it's all there. And this is what the development, of course, actually looks like. So the good news, and I'm about to end the good news, because I want to turn to the reality on the other side in a moment. The good news is ending poverty is within reach. When Watt and Adam Smith and Thomas Robert Malthus were living at the same time in Britain at the end of the 18th century, the global poverty rate was about 90%. When the Millennium Development Goals were adopted in the year 2000, the poverty rate baseline for the developing countries was 43%. There had been a lot of human progress. But in the developing world, the rate of extreme poverty below the $1 per day level, actually it's $1.25 per day level, was still 43% in the developing countries. The Millennium Development Goals were adopted in 2000 to cut that rate by half. So the 1990 poverty rate was 43%, and it was supposed to come down to 21% by the year 2015. In fact, 21% was reached in 2010. So poverty in the developing countries did come down by half by the year 2010. And in the most recent data that we have, which unfortunately is 4 years old, the World Bank estimates that in 2011, the poverty rate was down to 17% in the developing countries. My guess is that by this year, the poverty rate in the developing countries, when we finally measure it, will be something like 14%. Nearly zero in the high-income world, and in the developing countries around 14%, 1 in 7 still in extreme poverty. What it means is that the idea that we could end extreme poverty is absolutely realistic. President Kennedy was right. We hold in our mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty. It's not a dream. It's actually a physical reality within grasp, if we choose to grasp it. And SDG number 1 will be end extreme poverty. This is already agreed. So the world community will take the goal that by the year 2030, extreme poverty should be brought to an end. Act 1. Now the bad news. Not all is well in Eden, even with our technological revolution. First, our societies in general are becoming vastly more unequal. Again, Scandinavia is both our role model and our paradigm. Don't lose what you have, please. Which are societies that are the most equal in the world, as well as the most prosperous. And I know that everyone here knows, but I'll be proud to say it, that I publish every year a report called the World Happiness Report. And every year, Denmark is number 1 on the list. Now, that's not rigged. That's just how you answer the questions. But I do think that it comes from the fact that you have mixed prosperity and social equality. And it is only a dream for the rest of us in the world. The United States, by contrast, shown in this famous graph of the share of the top 1%, this U-shaped graph, went from a super high level in 1929 on the eve of the Great Depression. Through the New Deal, it came down sharply. During World War II and the post-war period, it was quite low. And then starting in the late 1970s, the inequality started to soar again. And by most measures, the United States has the highest inequality in its history now. And I would say this has profoundly corrupted American society. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Inequality is a major spreading problem in much of the world. China, which has had the fastest economic development in history, has also had sharply rising inequality during the period. Now, it's true, everyone was poor in 1979, and now many people are rich, but this rise of wealth has come together with a significant increase of inequality. And part of the result of this is a lot of instability socially. The rise of inequality has many complex factors. I want to name 3 very briefly, but I can't do justice to this topic in a few minutes. The 3 most important factors are certainly technological change, globalization, and politics. So where politics works well, and I would again point to Scandinavia if I may, the pressures from the market and technological change are counterbalanced by equalizing forces that come from politics and from society. Whereas in the United States, politics amplifies the inequalities coming from the marketplace and from technology, because our politics runs off of campaign contributions from the rich, and therefore it amplifies any market forces that are enriching the top. That gets that leads to a positive feedback, which has negative social implications, but it leads to an amplifying feedback in our politics. Well, I've collected pictures as I visited the world in the last few years of the unrest that is coming, in my view, from a lot of the dislocation from rising inequality. The population trends remain dangerous for us. We have not stabilized the world population. If you look within Europe, the concern is, how do we get more fertility, pro-natal policies? How do we raise population growth? I think it's a wrong question and a big mistake. If you look globally, the world population continues to increase at a rate of 75 to 80 million net population per year. And that means every 12 or 13 years, another billion people are being added to the planet right now. And in Africa, where the fertility rate remains out of control, basically, the prospects are frightening unless there's a change. Because in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, the population went from 179 million people in 1950, 179 million people in all of sub-Saharan Africa, to 1 billion people today. And if you look at the UN scenarios, the medium scenario is to reach 4 billion people by 2100. Can you imagine a part of the world going from 179 million to 4 billion in an era of water stress, climate change, and the rest? It's not possible. But it gives you an idea of the underlying demographic pressures that are also fueling the migration pressures and many of the other difficulties of development in Africa. So the world population as a whole is still on a path to exceed 10 billion people. And we don't have the wherewithal, in my opinion, to support 10 billion people in a sustainable, dignified, prosperous manner with all of the environmental pressures that have been built up. And so population stabilization remains, in my view, one of the important parts of sustainable development. Now, all of the environmental challenges have been summarized by a concept that I find extremely useful called planetary boundaries. And this is a concept that was pioneered by Professor Johan Rockström of the Stockholm Resiliency Center with a group of about 25 other world-leading ecologists who identified the major ways that human activity is trespassing on the physical Earth's limits and setting off tipping points that are extremely dangerous for the Earth systems and therefore for our own survival. If you go around this circle, which they published in the year 2009, at the due north is climate change. This is certainly the #1 most dangerous part of the human effect on the environment, coming through the rise of greenhouse gas concentrations. But if you go around the circle, it's all dangerous. 1 o'clock on the circle is ocean acidification, which is coming, of course, from the CO2 in the atmosphere dissolving in the ocean. And we've already had a decline of pH of the ocean, of the worldwide oceans, of about 0.1, which means a 30% increase of hydrogen ions in the ocean, or of acidity, since the pre-industrial period. This is having a dramatic effect already on marine ecology, on shellfish, on all plants and animals that build exoskeletons, on coral reefs, and so forth. Next comes ozone depletion. Next comes nitrogen and phosphorus loadings. Try to feed a planet of 7.3 billion people. You end up putting 150 million tons of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers on the soil. That runs off into the rivers, accumulates in the estuaries, and has already eutrophied, poisoned about 130 major estuaries around the world. Freshwater depletion, land use destruction, habitat destruction, loss of biodiversity, sometimes called the 6th extinction wave on the planet. massive loadings of aerosols and pollutants like we see in East Asia, in Chinese cities, in Indian cities, and other chemical pollutants. These are the planetary boundaries. But the idea is that we're reaching limits, and that these limits mean we have to change direction technologically so that our economies dramatically reduce the impacts on the physical environment. The most dramatic of all of the changes is climate change. And as you well know, 2014 almost surely will be the warmest year in instrument history when the December temperature tally is finally completed this month. We will learn that 2014 was the warmest year in the recorded instrument history. That means going back to 1880, but almost surely for hundreds or even thousands of years before that. We are on a path of dangerous warming. And I travel, as you might imagine, pretty extensively these days. Every single place that I visited during 2014 had a climate crisis that year, whether it was droughts, heat waves, floods, extreme storms, ocean surges. It was a year of seeing one disaster after another. And that's the world that we've already reached. Now, let me turn to solutions. This famous graph shows the alternative pathways of greenhouse gas emissions, specifically of carbon emissions. The top line of this curve is the business as usual path of our carbon emissions. It says that the emissions of carbon by burning fossil fuels is likely to something approximately triple in the 21st century, from about 10 billion tons carbon emission per year currently to maybe 30 billion tons carbon emission. To put that into CO2, multiply by 44/12 or 3.66. And so it's something like 36 billion tons CO2 currently to over 100 billion tons CO2 at the end of the century. If that happens, the amount of warming on the planet would be between 4 and 6 degrees Celsius. The safe path for emissions is the bottom line. It says that emissions peak and then come down sharply to zero. Emissions come down to zero by around 2070. So the message of safety is that if we do the bottom line emissions curve, then we can stabilize the temperature at below 2 degrees Celsius. But to do that, we have to decarbonize the world energy system, the bottom line. We have to get to net zero, actually, by around 2070. That's a tall order. 200 years we've built a world economy based on fossil fuel. In 30 years, we have to build it on wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration, or other, and there aren't any other large-scale, low carbon, zero carbon energy sources. So we have a massive transformation to be undertaken in essentially 2 generations. And that's the essence of the problem of the climate challenge. Now, what's the solution for sustainable development more generally? The back half solution, what needs to be done? We can make a list. It is to go to a low carbon and then eventually a zero carbon world economy. It is to make changes in the agricultural systems to make those systems more resilient to climate change and less impacting on habitat. I don't have time to elaborate, but it does mean large-scale change of agricultural practices and systems. It does mean information-enabled urban environments for smart cities that are highly energy efficient, transport efficient, and pleasant places to live. And the city that we're in ranks at the top of the world's list for that. But we have about 1,000 cities around the world that are not sustainable cities right now. It means, from a social point of view, universal access to basic needs, especially health and education, which is far from reality today. Why does the Ebola epidemic rage in West Africa? Most importantly, not because of Ebola, but because there's no health system. That's all. Because the most basic things that one would do for epidemic control can't be done because there's no local health system. Because the countries have been too poor to mobilize a health system, and because the international assistance has been subscale in order to help them to do so. And finally, we should be stabilizing the world's population by mid-century at around 8.5 billion people. This is feasible. What would it take to do? Two simple things. Guarantee that every girl can complete secondary education, and make sure that there is basic family planning services and contraception available everywhere. And that is the proven combination to get a rapid voluntary reduction of fertility rates. It's all within reach. It's all absolutely affordable. The problem is it takes a massive amount of cooperation globally to bring about. In other words, we have to decide that we're going to do it. The big problem in the world is that the big powers of the world, the United States, Europe, China, India, have other things on their mind. What is really our daily fare? It's not any of these problems. Our daily fare of politics is Ukraine, Syria, Greece, Libya, Afghanistan, Senkaku Islands. If you look them up on the map, no one lives there. But it's a big issue, of course, in East Asia. That's what takes all of the energy from the system. And small issues like climate change, disease control, technology transition, mass education, water stress, ending poverty, these are footnotes for universities. Because we're stuck on the urgent, not on the important. And finding the cooperative route to the important is really the key. In the United States, my own country, our politics are stymied not by polarization. That is the wrong idea. Our politics are stymied by money, by corruption of democracy, by the power of big oil, by the military-industrial complex, and by big campaign contributors that don't like to pay taxes. This is really the ill of America. And the result is, next election cycle will be $10 billion of campaign contributions. If you can imagine that the candidates will raise $10 billion from powerful supporters, and we're going to call that a democracy rather than a market outcome. So that's the US problem right now. We can't see straight because of the money and because of the vested interests. I think in China and India, the issue is quite different. The issue for China and India is catching up. And the question they ask themselves every day is, should we just make the dash to catch up by burning as much coal, by building as fast as possible, or should we take the harder route of sustainable development? And they haven't made that decision yet, because catching up is a national imperative and sustainable development is a national imperative. And the answer to this question depends for them on the global environment. If the global environment is hostile and competitive, they're going to aim to catch up. If the global environment is cooperative and we're all doing the same thing, they will aim for sustainable development. And so this is a choice. And Europe, which most exemplifies the concepts of sustainable development and social democracy, is weighed down by an aging population, fiscal stress, weak geopolitics, and huge anxieties about the demographic explosions taking place on the borders of Europe. And that means that Europe's focused very much internally and not enough on leading globally. And this is a shame because Europe's message is the best message in the world about regional cooperation, democracy, and the concepts of social market or social democracy, because those are the concepts that are closest to sustainable development by far. So we have a big agenda this year, and I'll close here. Adopting sustainable development goals, adopting financing for sustainable development, reaching a climate agreement, and then to quickly add two concepts, directed technological change and the kind of macroeconomic policies we need. For the sustainable development goals, the list is almost set. We're close to adopting the list. As I told you, SDG number 1 will be end extreme poverty. For the financial framework, we need new global funding for health, for education, for sustainable energy. We need new models of climate financing, like the Denmark Climate Investment Fund, which really is a great pioneering institution that shows how to combine public and private investment into sustainable investments. To defend the 2-degree upper limit, we need an agreement in Paris that emphasizes not just short-term goals, but the path to zero carbon by 2070 or 2080. And then finally, I want to say we need to step up our technological efforts. You're going to hear a talk in just a moment about the technological revolution that we have. I want to make the point that technology gives us tools, but we haven't chosen to use them properly. And unless we direct the technological changes to the priorities that we have, sustainable energy, sustainable agriculture, sustainable cities, we'll have wonderful technologies for the rich, and we will yet destroy the environment and the social equity in the process. And so technology is not a neutral or market-driven or entrepreneurial-driven factor by itself. It is a directed factor of sustainable development. And I like to point out that almost every major technological change of our time, radar, cryptography, nuclear energy, the computer age, semiconductors, space science, the internet, the genome, medicines, discovering the Higgs boson, all of that has been a public effort where private entrepreneurship has played the role, but the public sector has been absolutely vital in saying this is the direction we need to move. Now, if you look down that list, a lot of those technologies came from the military, which is not what we want right now. We want sustainable development motivation, not military motivation. I'm going to conclude with one last observation of President Kennedy, who was the person that put the US on the mission to the moon. And you'll recall that he stood in Congress in 1961 and he said, "We will send a man to the moon and bring him back safely to Earth by the end of this decade." And what's incredible about that commitment of President Kennedy was that when he called for the moon mission, NASA had no idea how to do it. There was no plan. It took them 18 months to make a plan afterwards. It was pure political leadership. And NASA scrambled and figured out the Apollo project and the lunar module and the world's great engineering, and within 8 years, the task was achieved. And when President Kennedy was asked, why are we doing this? He gave this very famous answer, but I want to apply it to sustainable development. President Kennedy said, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. About the age of sustainable development, maybe if not the million-dollar question, maybe the two-degree question would be how to make world leaders enter that age. Because we've had wars, we've had famine, we've had flooding, tsunamis, you name it, terrorist attacks, yet they seem reluctant to enter that age. What will it take? Is it a big crisis? Is it a disaster? Is it a dramatic change on the technological scene? What do you see that it takes?
I think that the most important thing to achieve these outcomes is the vision of what we could achieve if we cooperate together. And so I think that the most important way to reach agreements is through inspiration rather than fear. Although fear is a great motivator, what leaders really want to know is, what does this mean for us? Does it leave us in a competitive or dangerous situation? Will you do the same as you're asking us to do? And so that kind of cooperation, I think, is vital. Taking into practical terms, what does a climate agreement really mean, is, strangely enough, not the way the negotiations usually work. In other words, the positive vision of what we could accomplish is not really on the leaders' minds most of the time. Now, I'll just make, if I could, one quick analogy to Denmark. Denmark made a 2050 plan for deep decarbonization. And Catherine Richardson and other scholars here worked on that to show that by 2050, through wind power, through electric vehicles, through other technological changes, Copenhagen already wants to be carbon neutral by the middle of the next decade, and that Denmark could be out of carbon fossil fuels by the middle of the century. That scenario needs to be done in every part of the world. Every country needs to have in mind, we could do this. It would even be a better life standard. And the others are going to do it too. So what we're recommending in Paris, in part of the agreement, is that every country should submit not only short-term commitments, but a vision to 2050 of how they intend to achieve deep decarbonization.
So the audience here are, for the most part, from the finance business, and I'm sure they would like to know how you view the future if those three events of 2015 actually go well, seen from your point of view. Well, let's be optimistic for a second.
Yep.
How will that influence the financial markets, do you think?
I think that the main question for finance is, of course, what do you finance? The role of finance, ideally, is to build human well-being by channeling saving to the right kinds of investments. And this is the classic role of finance. And, of course, finance has been central to economic development. In the last 20 years, however, and I'll say however, a lot of finance became about nanosecond trading. Finance, in a way, really did separate from the real economy. And finance became, to an important extent, a question of how one manages a portfolio at nanosecond speed with hyper fast trading. And trading rather than financing the real economy became the model on Wall Street. This doesn't work. We know that it doesn't work. Finance needs to assume its real role, which is building healthy, vibrant, prosperous economies by building new centers of technology. So the financial industry should be financing the transition to a low-carbon economy. If you're financing new hydrocarbon discoveries, something's not right, actually, because we don't need new hydrocarbon discoveries. We've got enough hydrocarbons to last us. We have more than enough. Some of them will have to be stranded. So to be financing Arctic exploration of deep sea or Arctic hydrocarbons makes no sense, in my opinion. To be financing the oil sands or the Keystone Pipeline makes no sense, except perhaps if carbon capture and sequestration operates at a large scale. So for this industry, the question is, what are you financing? Are pension funds, insurance funds, other long-term pools being directed towards long-term sustainable technologies? Or is maturity actually being ripped apart by taking long-term saving and putting it into nanosecond portfolios? That's a big question for me. And so I think that the structure of finance also has to be long-term investment for a long-term sustainable future. And that means becoming partners of investing in smart cities, of investing in infrastructure, of investing in the carbon transition. And we need to make sure the rules of the game, the regulatory environment, carbon pricing, public-private partnerships, risk reduction, all work in the way that you can also then operate to put your clients' long-term funds profitably to work in sustainable investment.
Professor Sachs, thank you so much. I'm glad your voice lasted.
Great, thanks.
Maybe that herring did its job anyway.
It did.
Or maybe it should have a tad of gammeldansk down there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.